morning, everybody. It's really nice to have the first slot of the day, or almost the first slot of the day, because everybody's already here, so we are not missing people, but at the same time, you haven't yet left. And this also gives me the good opportunity to talk about a topic which I was telling somebody earlier this day that either I will get banned forever from this event, or it's going to be a lot of fun. Or both, I don't know yet. So, first of all, I do a lot of work with different customers, different companies, and we talk about where should they spend their cybersecurity money on. Because obviously we all have limited budgets for what to actually work with. And by the way, if there's somebody who has an unlimited cybersecurity budget, the Nixu stand is over there. I'm very happy to talk with you today. But let's take an example. So we have awareness training. Some of you might have done awareness training, some of you might not. But the idea being that awareness training is a really useful tool. Or is it? When we try to compare it against something else, let's say security monitoring, for example, now the question from a client might be that, well, which one is actually better? Where should I actually spend my money? And when this question comes, what we naturally do is we go and take a look and try to understand that, well, are there any studies on this issue? Because we would like to understand what is actually more worth for our client, what is more fitting for their situation and so forth. So how do we actually make that decision when we start thinking about what is actually right, what are the threats out there? First of all, are the defenses effective to begin with? Second of all, is it efficient spending? When we put, let's say, $1 million into this, is it money well spent or not? Are we getting $2 million worth of protection or maybe $500,000? We don't know. And finally, is it actually right fit for the company? So what they are doing, is it actually addressing their problems in their context? Is it the right kind of thing that they want to buy and spend their money on? So to understand that, we really need to understand what the cyber landscape looks like. Today we will hear a lot of different talks about different areas, about different kind of threats that you want to understand. I'm hoping today to give you a little bit of tools on how to listen to those talks, how to interpret them. When you start seeing numbers, when you read into studies, when you listen to advice, hopefully I can give you some ways of how to deal with that, how to understand what's actually happening behind the scenes. This is an actual quote from Barack Obama about 10 years ago. They were setting up the US program on cybersecurity, and he was talking about how cybercrime is really huge business. It's causing huge losses across the globe. Really, really significant. $1 trillion US. For context, 1 trillion is quite a lot of money. It is about the GDP of Nordics combined. Russia is about 1.5 trillion. So this is a lot of money when you think about it. And this was part of his speech on how to justify the spending on US cybersecurity. Unfortunately, what happened next is that different magazines started doing research into this. They started looking into the sources of these figures, where they're actually coming from. What is actually represented by this number? Because if the number is not right, it might mean that we are focusing on the wrong things. Or we might be using completely wrong statistics. So what happened is that this particular one was from McAfee. There were a lot of different studies. There were Symantec studies. There were a lot of different studies giving different numbers. This particular one happened to be from McAfee. And once people started looking into it, they started realizing that there's all kinds of problems because the research behind it was quite solid. But at that point, they start thinking, well, okay, where are these big headline figures coming from? Where's the 1 trillion coming from? Is it based on asking people? Is it based on research? What is it based on? And it turns out that it wasn't exactly based on really solid science. There was a lot of interpretation coming into it. In McAfee's response to this, they stated basically, and which I fully agree with, I'm not blaming their numbers in any way, but they were saying that if you have a number, any number, whether it's right, wrong, complete nonsense, if it supports your story, you will use it. Because it really nicely justifies whatever you want to do. To me, this is really dangerous because now it doesn't really fulfill what we wanted to do earlier. We wanted to understand what is a real problem, where we want to focus, and now all of a sudden we have numbers that don't really back that up anymore. Microsoft published a really interesting study which has a brilliant name. And I'll come to in a moment why the name is what it is, but it's really brilliant because it really nicely focuses on why we have a problem in the cybersecurity area on this side. Basically, they studied different kind of cybersecurity studies, numbers, material from all over the place. And this was shortly after a lot of these facts came out. And they started thinking that why are we seeing so many problems with the numbers, especially on cybersecurity? Why are the studies so bad in general? So the name of the paper comes from this statistic that they used to demonstrate why cybersecurity studies are usually very bad. When you go and ask women and men how many sexual partners they have had over their lifetime, it turns out that men have had anywhere from 3 to 9 times as many women partners as men have had, or women have had men. If you have a statistical background, you might be laughing at this point because you realize why this is wrong. But needless to say, it is wrong for a very simple reason that also explains why cybersecurity studies are often wrong. In reality, for one person to have one partner, that means that there has to be one man and one woman involved in the transaction. So the average on both sides should always be the same. There should be exactly as many men as there's women. So in this example, the average is 1 because there's 3 people on both sides and both have had exactly 3 sexual partners in total. That average is out to 1. Why the studies are wrong? Because the studies look like this. You have few people, or in the case of cybersecurity studies, you have few companies or few government agencies or few people reporting these numbers. But then you have some who are over-reporting by a lot. And this is where the name for the study comes from. Because in these studies, the numbers come from these kind of errors. You have a lot of weird things happening, and this same thing happens with a lot of cybersecurity studies as well. The way they state this in the paper is basically that when we are seeing these numbers and figures, they are actually coming from a fairly small group of people or small group of companies. If you think about cybercrime, cyber attacks, they are not that common to begin with. It's not like your company is being hit by a major cyber attack every single day. And the same thing happens to everybody. So now the problem is that because we are measuring quite rare events, we end up with numbers that depend heavily on who is actually answering the surveys. Keep in mind a lot of the cybersecurity stuff is actually based on surveys. They send a questionnaire to people or they go interview people and ask that, have you had this kind of problem? How much money did you lose? What happened? It's not necessarily based on hard science in the sense that somebody would go and check the numbers, and it's very hard to calculate the numbers in the first place. So you start seeing all these kind of problems. In the Microsoft paper, this is literally the last sentence they end their study with. Basically, no faith whatsoever in studies. Now, I wouldn't necessarily go that far. I wouldn't say that they are worthless. I think there's definitely a lot of worth in them. But you have to be very careful when you're reading into the headline numbers and reading into the sort of conclusions drawn from those papers. Very often you actually have to go and check what was actually being studied, what was being measured, why, and does the headline number or the headline conclusion actually support that? Otherwise, you end up making horrible, horrible decisions on your spending and on your focus. Well, the quick question then is that, well, cybersecurity is a big thing, and I would fully agree. I do this for a living for a reason. I'm not here just to make money. I do this because I think it matters. So does it really matter if we use the bad numbers and the bad science to justify a good cause? Does it really matter? And this was sort of the McAfee response as well. Again, I'm not picking on McAfee for any other reason than because this one happened to be very public. It was actually one of the better studies out there. So their argument is basically that, well, it's a real thing, which I don't disagree with. Why not use the numbers to justify? Why not push this and say that, well, we should be focusing on this anyway, even though we don't have solid numbers on what the real damage is or the real losses or whatever are. Let me try to argue my case in another way. This is a recent study or recent paper that came out this year. I highly recommend reading it. Really good paper on cyber crime in general. And some of you might have guessed already, but cyber crime is defined in an interesting way that some of you might agree with and some of you might not. But that really plays into why this is a bit tricky. Let's say I'll go and talk to your board and show this slide. This is what cybercrime looks like today. There's a lot of money being made. 1.5 trillion US dollars. Literally, there's an economy the size of Russia of people hacking stuff. And this is why you need to buy, I don't know, firewalls, red team exercises, monitoring, whatever it is that I'm selling today. And that's the agenda I'm pushing. And there's a lot of money. These guys have a lot of money invested in attacking you. So you really, really, really need to do whatever I'm telling you to do. I think I might convince a lot of people with this story. Because these are literally all headline figures from the same study. And they are not wrong. I don't think they are wrong at all. But imagine I showed you this instead. And actually this is interesting. Rob, sorry for using your quote, but this is a Europol quote from last year saying that ransomware is the largest threat, which I, again, agree with. It's definitely one of the most visible ones, and it causes a lot of big problems for a lot of companies. You definitely want to be protected from it. But let's split that 1.5 trillion down into 1.5 trillion down into 15 billion USD chunks. Every icon there represents one such chunk. 15 billion USD is definitely not a small number, but it's quite small in that scale. The ransomware that we are interested in is the yellow one, and you can imagine that there's no yellow one anywhere in there. It's literally not in the statistics at all. What we are seeing is illicit online sales, which could be anything from drugs to smuggling people, to funding cyber terrorism, to anything really. Now, imagine if I use this slide and explain to your board that because there's so much online drug sales, you really need to buy my better firewall. Now, what kind of an argument would that be? Who would be saying that, well, since they are selling so many drugs, we clearly need to invest in cybersecurity? So where is the actual ransomware? We have to break this down a little bit more. It's there. If we split that large chunk there into 10 chunks, now we start finally seeing the ransomware. This is how much money there is in ransomware. And this is actually a lie as well, because it's only about half that size. I had to, for the sake of making this infograph, I had to make it a little bit bigger. So as you can see, I'm no longer really making my case for the importance of ransomware once we dig down a bit into what the study is actually saying. So how can you tell that you need to start being a bit careful and maybe concerned? And how do you actually interpret these numbers? Well, if you start seeing figures and nobody's explaining where they come from, the study is talking about and showing you useful figures, but it's not exactly explaining how or where some numbers come from, this is when you want to be really, really concerned. Because it might be that they are coming from a good source, or it might be that they are not. Another point is that when you start seeing really, really huge numbers, if you follow the news on cybersecurity lately, there's a lot of talk about trillions and billions and so forth. $1 trillion US is a lot of money. A really easy way to think about it, because people tend to get lost in big numbers. $1 trillion US is about the size of the economy of the Nordics. 1.5, roughly the size of Russia. And US, I think, today is somewhere around 14 or so. So you can imagine that if 1 trillion went into something shady, that's a lot of money. So at that point, you have to have some kind of justification or logic behind where the number is coming from before you should take it on face value. If somebody's saying that criminals are making this much from something, that's a good point to check if the math is correct and if it's actually supporting the thinking that you have. When we are doing extrapolation, we are interviewing a small group of companies, trying to understand what are the threats that they are facing, and then using that to justify what the threats are that the whole world is facing. That is usually wrong. Because the problem is that there's, again, a small number of companies that are getting hit by different things. We have the Maersk case, for example, really significant one, really interesting case study for ransomware, but you shouldn't take that as a kind of starting point and say that this is a typical attack that companies get hit with. That gives you really, really, really bizarre numbers to work with. And finally, when somebody is making their case with metrics that don't necessarily mean what they say they mean. So the unfortunate thing with a lot of studies is that you might see these situations where somebody, for example, interviews people and they ask that, were you happy with something? Especially if it's the person investing in it. That doesn't necessarily say what you think it says. You might be thinking that it's suggesting that the service that was offered or the security control that was implemented was really good. But that might not be the actual case. So what you would want to see is some statistics on effectiveness or attacks prevented or whether that company suffered more or less than somebody else. So you want to understand what is an actual metric that you would want to see that would support the kind of conclusions you want to draw. But at the end of the day, I don't want to make this sound like cybersecurity isn't important, because it's hugely, hugely important. I work on this area because, to me, this is one of the biggest threats we are facing right now. And there's a lot of interesting stuff happening. There's a lot of new ways people are protecting their businesses. But the challenge we have is that a lot of the numbers, a lot of the statistics, a lot of the reasoning we have, it's still a little bit vague. And to me, that's a problem. Because I really want to understand what is best for my client. And I want you to know what makes the most sense for you. I want you to understand what is actually happening on your company borders, who is actually attacking you, and how big of a problem is that. Because otherwise, the decision-making cannot really start. If you have no idea what's happening, if you have no idea what's coming, and if you have no idea if your investments went to the right things, you might as well guess. Because at this point, you are just guessing, basically, if you don't have any evidence to support it. So definitely keep this in mind. And today we will hear a lot of good talks from different people promoting different ideas. So think about it. How would you justify those? How would you know if they are good ideas? And I would be more than happy later today to discuss with some of you on what I think makes a lot of sense, what I have seen works, and what I have some proof for and what I don't have any proof for. So definitely let's continue this discussion later today. But that has been my start for today, maybe raising the bar hopefully a little bit and giving you the tools to understand and evaluate what you're seeing and hearing. So thank you.